All right, here we go. You're gonna learn 90% of photography in about 5 minutes. How's that sound? I think it sounds pretty good, so let's get started. The easiest things and the most important things you need to know are 3 different items. Stay tuned to the end, I'll tell you all 3 of those things. First one is shutter speed. The shutter speed, what you have to know is that as you go up the shutter speed range, it gets to a fractionalized values. Each of those fractions means the shutter is actually moving quite a bit quicker. So what you want to think about is kind of if you were to blink your eye. If I blink fast, it's letting in less light. Just like the shutter opening and closing. The quicker it opens and closes, the less light is let in. That is the fractionalized numbers at the top of the range. On the opposite end, if the shutter is open for a long time and stays open, it's just like you open your eyes and letting in a ton of light over a period of time. The camera's eyes, the image slowly gets brighter over time. That's how you get very detailed shots in very low light conditions. Keep to those solid numbers, the 1s, 2s, 3s, 15, 20, 30-second shutter speeds you see that show up on your camera. Now, the balance in between those two is that if you get too fast of a shutter speed, you're going to cut down on all the light that you're gathering, so your exposure isn't going to be quite right. There's a trick to getting that just right, and your camera will help you out with that, and we'll talk about that next. As you get into the longer shutter speeds, though, you're going to need to keep your camera as stable as possible. It's not easy to do if you're hand holding it. So anything less than about 1/60th of a second, you're going to have to put on a tripod because if it moves, it's going to be a lot of blur. So that's shutter speed. Use that as a variation. You pair that with ISO and you pair it with aperture. What your camera's going to help you out with is what's a meter. There's a little meter on your camera and it's going to be on the positive end and the negative end. It'll tell you if it's underexposed on the negative end or overexposed on the positive end, which means it's too bright or too dark. Your camera is guessing, so it's not always right, but it's factoring in based on the environment around you. You can balance those factors, your aperture, your shutter speed, and your ISO, you can find the perfect blend for your scenario. It's going to tell you what the exposure is for that image. So right in the middle of that meter that shows up is going to what your camera thinks is the perfect exposure. It is a great starting point. Moving on to aperture, aperture is another part of this equation. On the small end, apertures can be like f/22, or think of that like an iris of your eye. The more it closes down, the higher numbers, like an f/22, the less light is going to be let in. Your camera literally has these little blades that close up to allow less light into the camera. The opposite is also true. So if you're shooting like an f1.8, it's going to be a much wider aperture, and your camera's going to open up quite a bit more. Kind of like your pupil when it is dilating, it's letting in so much more light, which is why your vision gets a little bit blurry because it's too bright. Your camera is no different. The shallower apertures, the 1.8s, which is what we call shallower because it creates a shallower depth of field, which is where you get that nice creamy bokeh in the background. The last factor of that is going to be ISO, and ISO is a bit confusing to people, but the easiest way to explain it is as artificial light. It's what the camera is using to boost the exposure of an image and compensate for any of the settings you don't have quite right, or if there's just simply not enough light in the scene, because sometimes there's just not going to be enough light. And what you can do is move up the ISO range. So ISO is a range of 1 to well over 50,000. 100 is going to be the cleanest image you'll get with the least amount of assistance, the least amount of extra unnatural light, the added light that your camera is producing. And on the high end of that is going to be the absolute most your camera is going to be able to produce. And it's often going to be at the deficit of adding grain, or what we call noise, to the image. You want to manage the ISO, which is the lowest possible, with a shutter speed that works for your scene, and an aperture that fits the vision of the scene. And if you can manage all those 3 things, your metering will land right in the middle. It's very easy to get that dynamic right. You can practice by putting ISO 100 on your camera, and don't let auto ISO do anything. You'll just click over to your ISO settings on your camera, scroll all the way to the top, and you'll see one that says 100. 100 is not going to help you with the ISO range at all. It's not going to add any grain to your images. If you set it there, you can learn your other settings very easily though, and you can adjust your shutter speed and your aperture to fixate on that metering and make sure that you know how to adjust that meter so it's right in the middle. Of course, ISO can help you in a lot of situations, but when you're learning, it's a great way to see there's no handicap here. We're going to be able to say, this is 100, we're not adjusting it, it's going to be just right if we do our shutter speed and our aperture. And if you can't get there, that's when you boost your ISO up. So those are the 3 main things that you can get out of photography and start out and really start to take some awesome images. If you learn these things, you can get away from auto modes and you can take way better photos, and it doesn't take that long to learn. You got to think, longer shutter speed lets in more light. Shorter shutter speed lets in less light, but it also freezes action. The longer one does not freeze action. The aperture, big apertures, 1.8, are wide open. They allow a depth of field. They give a nice background blur, but they're also going to let in more light. Sometimes you may have to stop down to close out the light, move up to an f14 and f22. And last but certainly not least, you got to play with ISO. ISO, you don't want to go too high. Use it as your safety net for a lot of photos. Hopefully that works out. I'm telling you, that's 90% of cameras in 5 minutes or less. And it doesn't have to be hard. This doesn't have to be difficult. It can be very simple, and let's just keep photography as simple as possible.